God, my eyes are so bad. Okay. Good evening. My name is Steve Morley. I'm the mayor of Elmhurst, and I want to thank everybody for coming in. As you're all aware, because you wouldn't be here if you weren't, we have the opportunity to interface directly with the FAA tonight. They brought 4 people in tonight: Dominica Drozenal, it's close, Liz Corey, Derek Buchanan, and Christina Druitt. Now, I'm going to try to be as quick as possible so that we can get as much information as possible this evening. So first of all, I want to thank the FAA for coming. We have about an hour and 15 minutes tonight to try to get through as much information as possible. The FAA has a brief, and I'll say brief, presentation to kind of establish some of the ground data, shall I say, but then we're going to quickly go into Q&A. As we did last time, for those of you who came to our last FAA meeting, what we're going to try to do in an effort to get as much information out there as possible is, and Cassandra in the back and Mike Kopp, if you don't have these cards, and Bob will get into it in a minute, but we're going to try to answer as many questions as possible. The other thing I want to say, and I'm going to act as a moderator for this evening. It worked last time. The FAA said that's a format that worked well for them. What I want to remind people is that there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to O'Hare, runway rotation, fly quiet, O'Hare modernization, Chicago Department of Aviation, ONCC. There's a lot of different alphabet soup going on. Ultimately, these folks represent the FAA, which is kind of the federal authority that works with people who bring them plans. But in terms of decisions and what plans get submitted, that's not what these folks do. So they have a lot of good information, and I want to get them started as quickly as possible. Again, I want to thank everyone here. I'm going to turn over to Bob Dunn real quick for some quick housekeeping, and then we're going to get started. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to welcome everyone this evening. Thanks for coming out on a Tuesday night, and thanks again to our FAA representatives for coming out. We did do a similar meeting like this 2 years ago. I guess the energy and the interest was somewhat different back then. Elmhurst had experienced extensive airplane noise for many, many years. And then in 2013, we got very abrupt and welcome relief to that with the beginning of the O'Hare modernization plan and the build-outs that were occurring. So the use of the runway that affected us went down considerably. So it was a good thing for Elmhurst. And we had the meeting 2 years ago because I think the residents were in a fairly happy state back then as a result of that, but really we're interested in, geez, what's going to happen next? We know things were bad before and they seem to be okay now. What's happening next? So Christina was here and gave a very nice presentation on previous state, current state, and what we expect in the future. We're hoping to cover all your questions this evening. Again, I want to thank you for coming. As the mayor mentioned, we do have some cards to write questions down. We're going to try to consolidate the similar ones so that we can get most of the themes addressed and be efficient about it. And then I'll have the mayor ask those questions, and we'll keep the meeting moving along. Again, we want to try to get our FAA guests out of here at a reasonable time, and we thank them for coming. So I'll turn it over to Christina Druitt from the FAA. Thank you.
Hey, Bob, real quick. If you didn't get cards when you came in, you can get cards in the back, right? And throughout the night, if you have a question, just raise your card, and someone from city staff will pick it up and make sure that we get it. But that's how we're going to handle Q&A. We're going to read them off the cards. We good? All right. There you go, Kristen.
Thank you, Mayor Morley. Thank you, Alderman Dunn. And thank you, folks, for coming out tonight to listen to some things going on at O'Hare. From what I understand from talking to your alderman, to your city manager, looking at the local news, looking at the local newspapers, there are a lot of questions and a lot of concern about Fly Quiet. What Fly Quiet is, what's going to happen from here on out. So the slides I brought largely cover Fly Quiet. I wanted to kind of go do a little bit of basic reminding ourselves what Fly Quiet is, and then I'm sure there will be plenty of questions, and I'll talk about where Fly Quiet might go. So slide, please. Okay, so here's pretty much covered this already. I'll give you some history on Fly Quiet. It's been around for 20 years. Maybe you didn't realize that, but it has been. FAA, in its role in evaluating things from an environmental perspective to meet federal laws with respect to environmental policy. We do very thorough environmental analysis of any kind of a development when federal funding is involved. So I'll talk about our environmental considerations. And then touch on Fly Quiet, what's happening today, what might be happening for the next few years, and looking ahead to what that ultimately looks like. So, slide please. So background, as I mentioned, Fly Quiet's been in place. The program Fly Quiet has been in place for 20 years. And it evolved from even before that, from procedures that FAA air traffic folks developed in the 70s and 80s to try and be more respectful of the communities overnight. So it's been for a very, very long time a practice in the control tower at O'Hare to think about the communities around the airport and try and find ways to help minimize as much as possible the noise impacts to the communities around O'Hare. So when the ONCC came into existence, the O'Hare Noise Compatibility Commission, and stop me if I throw out an acronym that you don't know. I'm sorry, sometimes we just fall into our acronyms and we don't think about everything behind them. The O'Hare Noise Compatibility Commission has 59 community members, 40 some odd actual communities like Elmhurst, and the rest are school districts. I don't know if your school districts are part of ONCC as well. So it's getting to be a much larger and much more active community organization. It has existed for 20 years, and let me tell you, the FAA looks to the ONCC as a model around the country for what community involvement and community activity with respect to moderating noise from an airport can be. It's a very mature group, very developed, that does a lot of really smart things. In the early years, ONCC spent a lot of their energy looking at the federal funding for sound insulation and prioritizing what schools need to have sound insulation. The schools in Elmhurst are all sound insulated as part of the work that ONCC did with federal money, working with the Chicago Department of Aviation. So there's a lot of good history in terms of the kinds of things that the ONCC has done over the years. The program, Fly Quiet, is a series of voluntary noise abatement flight and operating procedures, and I have to stress voluntary. Federal law does not allow an airport operator or a community to prevent airport operations. There's one airport that had been doing that before the law came into effect in the, I want to say, early 80s, and that's John Wayne out in California. They actually do have programs that curtail evening operations, but the rest of the country doesn't have that. It's a very high bar from a federal standard to try and prevent economic activity and the commerce that comes from air traffic activity. So the ONCC and the Chicago Department of Aviation have agreed to work together on a voluntary noise abatement program with the Federal Aviation Administration, and that is what has been in place in some shape or form since 1997. There are three different things that are part of this voluntary noise abatement program. Preferential runway use, and I'll talk about that with some of the diagrams I have. Arrival and departure procedures. Again, I have some diagrams that illustrate that. And the last one I'll mention very briefly, ground run-up procedures. And what that means is, there's a lot of aircraft maintenance that goes on at O'Hare. It might get done overnight. In order to test the engines, after you've worked on an engine, you need to run it up. You need to get a lot of RPM in it. It's going to create a lot of noise. There are sound there are structures out on the airfield with a lot of sound baffles that are used to pull the aircraft in. That's where they do their engine testing. It helps dampen the sound, and then they pull the aircraft out. So I'm not going to get into that here. Those kinds of things are much more immediate concern to the communities immediately around O'Hare. I don't think communities as far away as Elmhurst experience any issues or hear the ground run up the engine testing. Before I go any further, I do want to clarify roles and responsibilities. Mayor Morley has tossed out a few acronyms, and I'm using a few acronyms. So I've talked to you about what the ONCC is. The Chicago Department of Aviation, it's a department under the city of Chicago, owns and operates O'Hare and Midway airports. It is a city office, it is a city department, and they are responsible for everything that goes on at O'Hare. They decide what runways are open and closed. They are the ones that put forward the O'Hare modernization plan, so they're the ones that had the thought of how, here's a better way to put the runway, lay out the runways, and a more efficient way to use the airport. FAA has multiple roles in all of this. The one that's probably very obvious to most people is air traffic control. We do provide air traffic control services at O'Hare and many, many other airports around the country. So we do play an important part in the operation of O'Hare Airport. We provide the safety of aviation, air traffic control services. We don't decide which piece of pavement is open. We don't decide which piece of pavement needs maintenance tonight or tomorrow night. Those kinds of things are the responsibility of the Chicago Department of Aviation, or CDA. So other roles and responsibilities the FAA has, I mentioned earlier, we have the obligation to ensure that any time federal money gets spent, and we have provided federal grant funding for many different things at O'Hare, that any kind of changes follow the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. I hope I don't throw that acronym out too much, but every federal agency has that obligation to go through the laws that govern sound environmental practices when federal funds are being used for public improvements. So with respect to the O'Hare modernization, we had a large role in reviewing everything that CDA proposed, reviewing that from an environmental perspective and ensuring that it met environmental requirements and laws. So those are the three different entities that I'll be bouncing around between tonight and I'll be talking about. And if you need me to repeat any acronyms again, just say something and I will. So the next slide, please. So I think you went one too many? No? Nope, okay.
It's a PDF, so.
I'm sorry. Can you do that in presentation mode? View. He said if you go into view, you can go to presentation mode. Full screen. Thank you. Didn't bring my IT specialist. So if you go back to the original Fly Quiet, it had a page full of these preferential runways, and if you recall, that's one of the three ways that we can help minimize the noise that's experienced by communities near an airport. Preferential runway use. There used to be more layouts, more different runways that were used for overnight operations. As the O'Hare modernization has been built, two runways have been decommissioned, so they are not available. One of them was part of Fly Quiet. And as the city has shortened a runway, it's not as usable as it used to be for overnight operations. So you can see the airfield has evolved from 1997, when Fly Quiet was originally conceived. So I'm painting a picture here. We're getting to where some of the preferential runways are not quite as, are not available anymore, or not as optimal as they used to be. So that's just one piece of the three different prongs to what this noise abatement plan is. If you go to the next slide. The other thing I mentioned are arrival and departure procedures. So these were developed, again, many years ago, and you'll see some of these procedures, instead of going straight off the ground, they're curved. And that's, again, this is to fly along the Kennedy, so you're flying over a developed corridor. This is to take it down along the 294 corridor. This departure procedure takes it up more over Elk Grove versus straight out over on some of these other procedures. Some of these other departure routes are straight over residential areas. So this is another way. Again, this is an entirely voluntary program, and the airlines are part of it as well. So a lot of what our air traffic folks do is talk to the airlines a lot. A lot of what ONCC and CDA do is talk to the airlines a lot about adhering to these kinds of procedures that are in place, again, to direct traffic over areas that might be more compatible land use with respect to sound and noise. Okay, so enough with the history. So that was all in place, and that was operating for many years. In the early 2000s, Chicago Department of Aviation said, time to modernize O'Hare, and put forward many different plans, which we analyzed from an environmental perspective, and came up with the plan that's now almost completely constructed. This is right out of our record of decision. A record of decision is that agency decision, that federal decision at the end of an analysis saying, this is the project that you can go forward with. If there's mitigation in there, we detail the mitigation that's necessary, and this is the federal record of decision. This is what the O'Hare modernization will look like. In our environmental analysis, we recognized Fly Quiet existed. We recognized Fly Quiet was a very important component of operating O'Hare. And at that time, neither CDA nor ONCC were ready to talk about how to do Fly Quiet differently once the airfield looks different. And so this is from our record of decision in 2005 when we finished the environmental review for the proposed O'Hare modernization. We recognized that Fly Quiet isn't going to work. So those earlier slides I showed you, some of those airfield configurations have started to fall off the page. We recognize that. CDA recognizes that. ONCC recognizes that. So that means there's more work, more homework ahead of us. So this is out of our record of decision, and it talks about the future, which is coming sooner and sooner now. Fly Quiet will be modified by ONCC in the future only if needed. The modification would be done in consultation with the FAA and the Chicago Department of Aviation. Modification requiring FAA action would be subject to environmental review. So a lot of the things that we've been through as we reviewed and completed our environmental analysis of the O'Hare modernization, some of those things have to happen again if and when CDA and ONCC say, we want to do something different with Fly Quiet. So next slide. So what did CDA and ONCC started thinking about that about a year and a half ago, and I don't mean this to be an eye chart, but there are 3 sets of slides. Around the beginning of calendar 16, so 2015 was the last new runway, the most recent runway commissioning of a new runway, let me put it that way, it's not the last new runway. And we did an environmental reevaluation for that. And as we finished that up and as that runway was commissioned, CDA and ONCC, I think, finally had enough energy to say, okay, we need to start thinking about Fly Quiet. Fly Quiet's got to change. We don't have the same airfield we used to have. So in summer of 2016, the first half of 2016, CDA and ONCC said, what can we do to figure out what else might work for Fly Quiet? An ad hoc committee was stood up as part of the ONCC, and several communities became a part of that. The ad hoc committees met quite frequently. CDA worked very hard, brought in some different consultants to help figure out different ways to use the airport. So if you can show the next 2 slides quickly. So there were 3 different tests for different ways to use the airfield for Fly Quiet. Really briefly, the red arrows are arriving aircraft, the green arrows are departing aircraft, and you can see that they're trying to hit different communities on different weeks. Each diagram is 1 week of a test. So for 6 months last year, they tested that first plan that was an eye chart. For 12 weeks earlier this year was Fly Quiet Test 2, And right now, what you're experiencing is Fly Quiet Test 3, which ends a week from Saturday. And then, so what happens when the test ends? Well, if you go back 3 or 4 slides to the 4 squares, one more slide back, those are the runways that are the preferential runways to be used for Fly Quiet until a different Fly Quiet plan is proposed by CDA, reviewed and discussed by ONCC, and a recommendation is made to the FAA for environmental review. So the 3 tests I showed you, we did an environmental review for those. It was, the NEPA does not require a thorough environmental analysis. It requires a comprehensive review, but if it's for a test, if it's 6 months or less, it is not something that involves public input or anything else. So ONCC and CDA did what they needed to do to put together a plan for a test. We did our environmental reviews and said, yes, you can do a test. The test can't be more than 6 months. So they have done now 3 tests and gathered a lot of information, and that hopefully all gets put together and used by CDA and ONCC in developing what makes sense going forward for Fly Quiet. Something really different that was introduced with these tests that we weren't aware of being done anywhere else in the country is this idea of rotation. So some nights you're using east-west runways, some nights you're using the diagonal runways, the runways that go from the northeast to the southwest. We're not aware of any other airport in the country that tries to do that, to share the noise, if you will, with different communities. So that's a very different thing that we all are observing and learning from. Where that goes, we'll see where that goes. So CDA and ONCC are being very creative. They are listening to the different communities, but there are so many different communities around the airport, and there are many of the communities like Elmhurst are members of the ONCC. Some communities aren't members of ONCC. You might have heard of the Suburban O'Hare Commission, which I think still exists, and some of the communities to the west of O'Hare, Bensonville, Elk Grove, are members of the Suburban O'Hare Commission. They've hired consultants that are also welcome at ONCC meetings and CDA meetings to talk about different kinds of ways to use the runways overnight that might work well for the communities. So the really good news, and I realize on the underneath an approach or a departure path, nothing really feels like good news when you hear the airplanes going over. But the thing that's really innovative and good news is that a lot of communities are involved, and a lot of communities are making sure that their concerns are heard. And I think that's one of the reasons why the mayor invited us to come tonight, was because they want to make sure that Elmhurst's interests are being heard and considered, and certainly that you have good information to base your thoughts on. We can go ahead. So next slide. Okay. So as I said, there were 3 different Fly Quiet tests. From what I know, the city is no longer going to test different configurations for Fly Quiet, and the predominantly east-west runways that are left from the original Fly Quiet should be the ones that are used come the 15th of October. The purpose of test 3, as with the other 2 tests, to check out different things. We learned so much from test 1, just from an air traffic perspective. FAA learned a whole lot from test 1. What works well for air traffic and what doesn't. We provided a lot of feedback on that test to CDA to say, please don't do this anymore. We don't think this is the safest way to run this operation, but if you do this, it works really well. A lot of feedback from test 1. And same with CDA. There's a lot that happens on an airport overnight. Federal regulations require inspections and maintenance. A lot of maintenance is done overnight because during the day, the airport's just too busy. CDA Operations Department learned an awful lot from that first test. How to best utilize their crews overnight, when and how to do the inspections. And a lot of good ideas have come out of all 3 tests. And so test 3 is almost finished, as I mentioned. And what comes next? 2 different things have the potential for coming next. After October 15th, we go back to that runway configuration that I showed you, predominantly using east-west runways. but it's a voluntary program. So it doesn't mean that other runways can't be used, and if certain wind conditions are prevalent, we're better off using the 422 runways, which affect your community. It's not a guarantee that every night's just going to be the east-west runways. We have to operate safely, and sometimes that means using the diagonal runways. But beyond that, so if you could please go to, I think the next slide, right. So again, I'm sorry if these look like eye charts. This is the airfield today. We've got 2 runways on the north side of the terminal, and we've got 3 runways on the south side of the terminal. There's 1 more runway being built right now through the middle of the north half of the airfield. That's runway 9 center, 27 center. That's scheduled to complete in the fall of 2020. The city's already let some of the contracts, the construction's well underway, construction's going well. So we have every reason to believe that in the fall of 2020, there's 1 more, the last new runway for the O'Hare modernization will be finished. Then there's 1 more smaller project, and that's a runway extension on this runway here. Next spring, this runway will be decommissioned. All right, that's called 1533. That will be decommissioned. So what the city and the ONCC have started talking about is an interim fly quiet. So what will fly quiet look like from next spring, when runway 1533 is decommissioned, until the fall of 2020, when runway 9 center, which is over here on this diagram, that would have been easier, when this runway is commissioned. What will fly quiet look like? Those conversations have started. Those meetings of the Fly Quiet Ad Hoc Committee of the ONCC have started. And I believe your community gets involved in those and participates in those, as do many other communities. They're talking about rotation. And what will the lessons learned be from the 3 different tests that happened? That still remains to be analyzed and looked at. When CDA and ONCC come up with a plan for that, comes to the FAA, and we do a pretty comprehensive environmental review. It will include public meetings, opportunity for public input, and taking that public input and comparing that to what the plan is and what the impacts from that plan might be. But it's an interim. It's being called interim fly quiet because once this runway is finished in the fall of 2020, there's an opportunity to do, again, something more and different with fly quiet. And that's a much bigger chore that lies ahead. ONCC and CDA haven't talked about it a lot yet, but they've started thinking about the fact that after the fall of 2020, what does fly quiet look like then? So again, that's another process that will go from the communities to the ONCC for review, for approval, if you will, by ONCC, CDA tossing something over to the FAA saying this is what we want to do. Then we have that obligation to do a very comprehensive environmental analysis, which includes public input. So I see 2 different opportunities for the communities around O'Hare. There's involvement in this process to figure out what the interim fly quiet will be, and then there's involvement in the process for the longer term, what happens after all of the OMP construction is done in the airport. Looks like this, with six runways in an east-west direction, and the 2 runways from the northeast to the southwest. So 2 opportunities, timeframes on those things. The ONCC and CDA have started talking about interim fly quiet. They would like to have it ready for next spring when 1533 is decommissioned. I don't think there's enough time for that right now. It might be next summer, it might be next fall. So you're talking about 2 years with some sort of an interim plan and a lot of discussion about rotating runways, different weeks, doing different things on the airfield. And more of a blank slate is then what happens when OMP is finished in 2020, when we have that last new runway, 2021 when we have that last runway extension. What does fly quiet look like then? So similar processes, they become more and more comprehensive once the proposed change is a long-term change. That will be a longer, probably much more in-depth environmental analysis than for this interim period, but please don't misinterpret that. We will do a very thorough analysis for this interim period as well. We're talking 2 years of impacts, or changes, I should say. We haven't figured out what those impacts are. I think, so this goes back to getting involved, sharing what you think is best for your community with your community leaders, participating in ONCC meetings and finding other opportunities to tell your elected officials what you think is best for your community. Right now, the city has a website, and I know it was talked about in some of the local newspapers and Channel 9, I think, one report on Channel 9. There's a website that you can provide your comments to the City of Chicago on Fly Quiet Test 3. The gradation in color here, these are the communities that responded the most to those tests. So the darker colors show communities that responded most to test 1 and test 2, and your community did a lot of that. So kudos to you. And test 3, as I said, does not end until the 14th of the month. I think there's one more slide I wanted to show.
You know, were these 2 slides taken from the test 1 and test 2 analysis?
Yes. Yeah.
So you can go online to look at this closer if you can't see this now.
Yeah, everything that I've put up here in the slides is available online. The Fly Quiet plan, the original the current Fly Quiet plan is on the O'Hare Compatibility Commission website, o'harenoise.org. The test results are on CDA's website, and I believe all of those web pages are here in the presentation. We're leaving the presentation here with Elmhurst, and you're welcome to put it on your web page, distribute it to your community through email, whatever it is you think is appropriate with this information. Everything that I showed you is available from these links. So, I'm ready to take questions.
Ready for questions?
Yes,
okay. We've got a lot of great questions here, and Alderman Dunn's doing his best to try to consolidate them. But I have 3 questions to go through right off the bat. First one is, you had mentioned that the CDA, Chicago Department of Aviation, and ONCC they might be working on possible plans, and any plans that get, any runway changes or any operational changes that happen at O'Hare, a plan has to be developed and then come to you. So independent of a new plan coming, can you go into, to the best of your knowledge, what is the plan that runway, Jim, can you pull up any one that shows 4R22L? So there you go. Okay, so the lower right runway, that's the one that clearly affects Elmhurst the most.
Right.
So you had mentioned, you had mentioned that we go back to the original rotation, the original Fly Quiet.
It's not, the original plan is not a rotation.
Not a rotation. So we go back to the original Fly Quiet plan, are supposed to go back on the 15th or 14th of this month. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to the best of your knowledge, the future of 4R22L? Is it people, people say, well, I heard it was going to be closed at some point, and
okay.
all that kind of. So can you speak to the future of that diagonal runway from now until full OMP, O'Hare Modernization Plan build-out?
Sure. The diagram on the right here, this is what O'Hare will look like when the O'Hare Modernization Program is finished. 6 east-west runways, 3 to the north of the terminal, 3 to the south, and the diagonal 4 left, 2 right, and 4 right, 2 left are there. This is O'Hare, when it is all finished, has 8 runways. Most of the time, weather conditions allow traffic to flow in an east-west, east flow, west flow, east-west direction. If you were here 2 years ago when I was here with Paul Litke from our traffic organization, he spent some time talking about the different ways O'Hare gets used from an air traffic perspective. This runway, both these runways will always be an important component of O'Hare operations. They are not going away because there are certain wind conditions, a very small percentage of the time, but there are certain wind conditions when traffic needs to use those runways. And so in order for O'Hare to be available 99.9 whatever % of the time, we also need to have some runways that are not in an east-west configuration.
Okay. So as it comes to changing a plan, and specifically, you mentioned 2 potential plans coming in the future. One was the short-term interim fly quiet plan that is pending, and then possibly once the full build-out, another analysis, maybe a longer fly quiet plan. Can you speak to a little bit of the timing? Let's stick with the interim plan for now. What your expectations are in terms of timing, and a little bit of the process. Who comes to you and presents it to you? How long does that take? You know, what kind of comments you have to those plans, whether you change those or not. And then the other thing to add on to that is, as part of that plan review process, can you go a little bit into EIS studies, environmental impact studies, and then finally, a question that we do get asked, and I'll remind you if you, but finally, we do get questions about safety. So the best example I can give is if the police department closed down York Road and I was the only driver, it'd be pretty safe for me. But that's not realistic. So in terms of runway operations, how much safety is considered in terms of size of runway, size of plane, et cetera. I assume that, can you speak a little bit to how, certainly you would never approve a plan that you consider out of bounds from a safety level, but can you talk about how safety is considered?
So I'll start with the end and try and work my way
Okay.
backwards. And we've heard this from different communities that since the runways, the 422 runways are, what, 8,000? One of them's just over 8,000 feet long, and the other one's 7,800, something like that. Here we go. 7,500 and 8,075 feet. So they aren't the longest runways at O'Hare. We've got 10,000 and 13,000 foot runways at O'Hare. So yes, everything the FAA does, safety is our primary mission. It all comes down to safe aviation operations. Let me tell you though, we're not going to invest a lot of federal money in an airport that doesn't have safe pavement. Just like I would assume Elmhurst isn't going to put a lot of money in a road that doesn't meet IDOT standards for lane width and shoulders and sidewalk separation. Very similar kinds of concepts apply to airfield design. And so not every airplane that potentially will use O'Hare can operate on a 7,500 foot runway. I'm not going to try and convince anyone of that. The A380 is, Lufthansa is supposed to start A380 service sometime soon if they haven't already. An A380 is not going to land on a 7,500 foot runway or take off from a 7,500 foot runway. So just like you've got oversized loads on certain streets, you wish you might have had wider streets. 2 of the runways that are part of the O'Hare modernization are wider, specifically designed to meet the criteria for those much larger aircraft, like the A380 and the 747-800. So between air traffic and all the safety training and safety mission that air traffic has, and the airlines have their own policies and procedures and train their pilots thoroughly and have their own specifications for which aircraft, for aircraft performance. If there's a 7,500 foot runway available and an airline or its pilot don't feel comfortable using it, they'll ask air traffic for a different piece of pavement, and we'll work with them to find them a longer or a wider runway to meet their needs. So I think some folks have been trying to say you can't use the 422s overnight because they're shorter runways. That's not the case. And CDA did establish a program with the airlines for the purpose of these tests. If a carrier felt they needed something longer for a runway overnight in some of these various configurations, they let CDA know, and CDA opened that runway, and it was used for that operation. So just as Elmhurst wouldn't build streets that most of the cars couldn't use, we don't put federal money in runways that the fleet that's out there using the airport can't use.
So just to wrap up on safety, it's suffice it to say that the FAA wouldn't approve any plan, specifically a runway, a fly quiet rotation plan, that in any way compromise safety. It's certainly
Absolutely
something
not.
that is
Yes,
taken into
you're
consideration.
totally correct.
Okay. EIS studies, why are they needed? How do you perform them?
So an environmental impact statement, the environmental impact statement for the original O'Hare modernization was 10 volumes of 3-inch thick binders. I don't know how many pages that was, but it was very comprehensive. It was a 3-year process by the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA is the federal law that tells a federal agency what they have to do when a project is being proposed that impacts a community. We have to analyze water quality, air quality, wetlands, wildlife, endangered species, threatened species, historical structures. There are 23 or 24 criteria under NEPA that must be thoroughly analyzed before a federal agency can approve a project for it to be funded and to move forward to construction. So EIS is very comprehensive. The original EIS is on our webpage, our web address. The webpage for that was up there. And I'm not going to deceive you. It can be quite boring to try and find what you're looking for in a document like that. It's very thoroughly indexed, and the things that you might be concerned about, be it air quality or noise impacts, are highlighted in the index, and you can find those sections. I can tell you a lot of modeling goes into something like an airport, so that we look at the entire fleet mix, we look at the airline schedules, all of those things are modeled and evaluated in coming up with what are the impacts and then how can we mitigate those impacts. Some of the mitigation that came out of our original EIS included wetland relocation. There were some wetlands along Irving Park Road that CDA had to buy compensatory wetland. I believe it was somewhere in the near south suburbs. So things like that are in place. That's a mitigation. Another mitigation, an obvious one, sound insulation for homes. Something like 9,000 homes, as well as over 100 schools, have been sound insulated as part of the activities at O'Hare. So
as it relates to any new interim plan, there would be an EIS study?
It depends on what the plan is. There are many different levels of environmental analysis, let me use that word. There are environmental assessments, there are reevaluations, there are supplementals. It depends on the order of magnitude of what is being proposed, and then we will follow the appropriate guidelines for those processes.
Who does the environmental study, the FAA or? The
FAA with contractor support, yes.
Okay, so that's something that is done as a result of the ONCC and CDA coming to you with a plan?
Yes.
Okay. And then specifically, can you just talk a little bit about the timing and a little bit about the details of the short-term interim plan, what you expect them to bring you, when, and when would you get back to them with a decision? And what if you find something in there that you have a question about? How do you handle that? So timing, that lies with ONCC and CDA, not to be evasive, but they if Alderman, if you've been to some of those meetings, I know you've been to some of those meetings, the conversation can get quite heated and progress can be made at some meetings and progress might not be made at other meetings. So there's a very honest effort on CDA and ONCC's part to make progress and put a plan together. Idealistically, everyone wanted to have something ready for spring when 1533 is decommissioned. Realistically, I don't think that's realistic, let me put it that way. Our reevaluation, when we did the reevaluation in 2015, we did that because CDA changed the commissioning sequence of the runways. So we did a very comprehensive reevaluation, and some of you may have come to some of our public meetings. We were up in Bensonville, Elk Grove, I'm sorry, I can't recall the other two locations, Chicago, one other suburb that we did a public meeting at with that reeval. That was something like a year-long process. I don't think this reeval will touch on as many areas. I don't know that it will take quite a year, but conservatively you could say a year from when we receive something from CDA and ONCC, FAA should be able to process that. And as I said before, there's part of that process includes
public workshops, opportunity for public comment, and then we have the responsibility, the obligation to take those comments and respond to them before we issue any kind of a final document or with our final document.
Can you speak a little bit to current volumes at O'Hare, past, present, and future?
Off the top of my head, don't quote me on this, for the last, I want to say 4 or 5 years, it's been around 880,000 operations a year. Some years might be 878,000, might be 781,000 this year. It varies by weather. It varies, even impacts like the hurricanes down in the Gulf and the Atlantic. Lots of flights at O'Hare got canceled, and O'Hare and Midway, because where were they flying? They were flying to the hurricane-impacted areas. Weather, of course, is going to, severe winter weather, severe thunderstorms are going to impact those numbers. In general, for the last several years, O'Hare operations have been somewhere between 870 and 880,000 operations over the course of a year, an operation being an arrival or a departure.
Okay. I want to jump back for a second. Of O'Hare, yeah. Do you have any prognostications on the future of the O'Hare volumes?
One of the things the FAA does is we have a program called the Terminal Area Forecast, and for all the major airports in the country, we do forecast what we think those operations will be. I have not looked at the most recent forecast, but certainly I can provide a link to you to share with the community where that information is. In general, we're optimists, and we want to promote aviation, not just aviation safety, aviation commerce, and aviation in all its forms. And so if you look at almost every major airport, you will see growth. The only question is, how steep is that growth curve? Is it kind of flat, or is it something that's skyrocketing? But certainly I'll take that IOU and get the forecast information for you.
Okay. I did want to jump back for just a second, though. You said that the FAA review process can take up to a year. Did I hear you correctly?
I want to be conservative for the crowd here, and I will say give us a year to review what this interim plan might be.
But do you have to provide feedback before it can be implemented?
Yes.
So,
it should not be implemented without thorough federal review and a formal decision from us.
So as we sit here today, in October, you are not in possession of a plan from ONCC or CDA.
No.
So if they get one to you, Bob, how long do you think that's going to, just curious, 3 months, 6 months?
Final test report for test 3?
Just no, any recommendation for a future interim rotation?
It will take several months.
Let's just say hypothetically, ONCC, CDA and ONCC work together, and ultimately a plan will be discussed at ONCC, and ultimately the plan would be voted on. And they come up with a plan, and they come up with a plan in January. And they present it to you in January. Are you saying that it could take up to, conservatively, up to an entire year before you provide formal feedback and approval? So we're in 17 now, 18, it could be January 19 in theory before a interim plan.
Best guess today, yes.
Is that, I mean, that's a fair.
Right, and just, it's not like it's a black hole that the plan gets submitted to. During that whole review process, there is a lot of dialogue that is ongoing, and there is a lot of dialogue and collaboration working towards that plan. As an example, our air traffic folks have been involved in with CDA as they've worked on these different test fly quiet test plans. We don't want anyone to do something to start down a road that isn't going to be safe or meet the criteria that we have for safe operation of air traffic. So it's a very collaborative conversation through the whole development.
I bring that up just because from a timing standpoint and how long before we would expect a possible change is that the time between Fly Quiet Rotation 2 and Fly Quiet Rotation 3 was pretty immediate. And there's been concerns or questions that have been asked, what happens when this ends? And from what you're telling us, your understanding is when this ends, we go back to the original,
Yes.
I won't even call it a rotation, the original plan.
Original fly quiet, yes.
Original fly quiet plan, and we could anticipate an interim plan a year and a half from now.
Yes.
Okay.
And sooner, it could be sooner. I don't want you to
Oh, I'm not
think you've got
encouraging that. I just,
Okay, all right. Okay.
I'm not pressing the timing. In fact, if you want to stretch it out a little bit, maybe we'll go out to lunch.
So I just want to address something that you mentioned. There was very little gap between test 2 and test 3 for a couple of different reasons. Because these are tests and they're very short term, as I mentioned earlier, 6 months or shorter, the environmental review is much briefer than it will be for something that remains in place for a longer period of time. Federal policy does allow us to do a categorical exclusion of an environmental review, which means we look at something for safety and we look at something for how short those impacts are, and it's a pretty straightforward process for us to approve a test. And so that and CDA and ONCC were pretty quick in, after test 1, they wanted to think about what they heard from test 1. It took them a while to come up with test 2. As they started test 2, they immediately started working on test 3. So you could look at our website to see when we received and when we approved those things. We could process the request for the tests very quickly. It's not a year-long process to approve that.
As it relates to the fly quiet rotation, the ones that were done and 3 that's going on right now, so FAA did evaluate fly quiet 3 before it was implemented, or at least gave approval?
Yes.
Does the FAA give any sort of, is any part of your decision process have to do with, well, first of all, why they're doing it? I understand that they want, the ONCC and CDA want to potentially share the noise. But then the other question is, specifically for Fly Quiet 3, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but as it relates to Elmhurst, it was a pretty significant impact. We went from maybe the previous 2 Fly Quiet rotations of maybe a 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 chance of a rotation that would hit us, and Fly Quiet 3 was every other. That's quite a big increase. So was that part of your decision process? Would that be part of your decision process or conversation in the interim plan?
I don't know. I can't answer that. I would imagine that the communities around O'Hare would want to spend a lot of time talking about that in the ONCC. And we go to ONCC meetings, and we go to the subcommittee meetings, and we listen to that. And so we do consider that. I cannot begin to express in what way that factors into our analysis. We hear it. We know it's there.
I understand. I guess maybe another way to put it is, how much would the FAA ever take a look at a plan and say, you know what, that doesn't seem proportional in terms of this rotation? Is that in your purview, or does that really not? Like, would you say, hey?
We haven't gotten there yet. As I mentioned early on, this is the first that we are aware of anywhere in the country where an airport operator has chosen to rotate what runways are used overnight as a methodology for distributing noise. So this is new for us, and I think it will give us some good homework to figure out how does this impact the communities, and how can we mitigate, how should this be mitigated? So bottom line is mitigation. When you do a NEPA analysis, if there are impacts, how do you mitigate them? So this is going to be really good homework for the FAA to break some new ground.
Okay, well, I'm sure you'll hear it at the ONCC meetings, but I'll go on the record now and ask you to consider the fairness of the distribution. I wouldn't say anecdotally, I'd say analytically, we don't believe that runway 3 rotation was very fair, just in terms of the volume that we had. Bob, what else we got here? This is a good question. I'm not sure how much you can answer, but I'd like to get the question out there. We have, and it's in part of the analysis of Fly Quiet 2, and it's certainly accessible. You put it on your last page there. there are opportunities for input from the public. There are surveys, and then there's noise complaints. And I'm curious to know two things. One is, how do those relate to your evaluation? Are those part of, if and when a plan is presented to you by ONCC and CDA really, do they use that data to try to support what they're doing? And do you ever verify that data? And the reason why I ask if you verify is that I believe the survey, which takes a little bit longer, is a little more accurate, or maybe it's a little more real. If you look at some of the complaints and the volumes, it's clear that some sort of
Automation
or
someone's
bot.
Developed a bot or an app that you
Yes,
can
I
just
don't-
keep pushing and it keeps
I
filing
don't believe
those
that
complaints.
all
yes.
but 150 residents of Bensonville answered, you know. So how are those data points considered by the FAA, if they are?
I'll have to take that as an IOU. We look at and evaluate all the information that's given to us. I don't know if I can, certainly I can't quantitatively answer that question, but qualitatively, we do consider everything that we have. And we see the same reports you see, that one community that has 10,000 residents had 7,000 complaints from 2 different addresses. And it's not just in Chicago.
Okay, so I mean, you're just not taking it at face value?
No.
Okay. Oh, that's a good idea. As part of the, and you mentioned it a little bit early on, and I actually had a follow-up on this too. I know that you said that a lot of these fly quiet plans are suggestions to the airlines and the air traffic controllers. Can you speak to you know, inclination when they take off or when they land, how high they are? Is that taken into consideration? The other question I have for you is, you showed that what I'll call a nice theoretical takeoff pattern where they're supposed to, the one with the blue arrows on, there one. Okay, so it's really a great idea that they take off of 22L 4R and fly over the interstate. But I think sometimes the pilots are drinking coffee or something and they're not really turning. So what's the,
So
it's a suggestion, but are they evaluate on these suggestions?
So what happens, what used to happen quite often has happened less frequently as the city puts CDA puts a lot of its resources in these rotation tests. Air traffic periodically meets with ONCC, well, many different pieces of the FAA meet with ONCC and CDA on many topics all the time. One specific example that I'd like to point out is CDA, when it has enough resources available, does plot out with accurate what the deviations were from these proposed flight tracks. And that is in the quarterly report on Fly Quiet that the ONCC puts out on its webpage. And they show green, orange, and red lines, actual flight tracks, how well that those air traffic instructions get adhered to. So, you know, we're not always perfect. Sometimes an air traffic controller might forget that there are certain instructions that need to be given to a pilot, and sometimes maybe that pilot's drinking the coffee, shouldn't be drinking the coffee on departure, but maybe their mind is somewhere else and they're not exactly following the path that air traffic gave them. Air traffic and ONCC talk. I can tell you that our air traffic folks follow through on those times when we think air traffic might not have been giving the right instructions, and again, those instructions are over here. Climb to fly runway heading for 1 mile, turn right on a 90-degree heading until to 3,000 feet. So all those kinds of things are designed to help try and mitigate the noise that's heard on the ground. So yes, air traffic has to follow through and give the right instructions to the pilots, and the pilots have to follow through and follow those instructions. Are they perfect? No, neither one is perfect. And sometimes weather also impacts the ability of the aircraft to do exactly that as well. So, but for the most part, if you go back and look at historically, look at that fly quiet performance, it has improved tremendously over the years.
Have the planes in general, let's just say in the last 20 years out of O'Hare, have they been asked to do a higher rate or a higher angle of ascent or a sharper angle of descent? Has that changed in the last 20 years?
No.
No?
No.
And is that something that, I mean, we know it happens. Anybody who's ever flown into like White Plains, New York knows how they fly in this way and go out that way. How much of a consideration or how much of a possibility is that to alter that type of stuff?
Historically, those kinds of procedures, like in mountainous terrain, I'm not familiar with White Plains, but if you're going out west into the mountains, we can design flight procedures that do those kinds of things, and we do that when it's needed for safety, for purposes of managing through difficult terrain. It's not optimal performance for an aircraft, it's not optimal in terms of fuel efficiency, and it could be noisier as well. So for other reasons other than safe operation of flight where you have terrain or obstacles, that's not typically done. Not to say that there can't be conversation about what other flight procedures can be developed. Many years ago, we developed a curved approach into Reagan National Airport flying along the Potomac. So there are things that can be done for reasons other than that.
How about, in general, plane noise when new planes come on? Does the FAA have guidelines or standards of how noisy a plane can be? And what has been done, let's say, what improvements have been done in the last 20 years to...
I'll have to take an IOU on that. I know there are, and I don't want to misspeak, so we'll get some information to you on that.
Okay, give me a minute.
Okay.
What else you got, Bob? Is that a private company, Bob? Is that who SOC hired? Yeah. Yeah. Do you know JDA?
I'm aware. It's a company with that does aviation consulting services, yes.
I mean, are they is there a lot of those folks out there? Are they looked at as favorable or reputable or? That's the answer I thought I would get, Bob.
There are many different consultants out there that provide a variety of aviation consulting services.
Okay, anything else, Bob? We've got them for like another 6 minutes. We should use them. Is there any hope of keeping 1533 open? Isn't that the one that's closing?
No.
And can you give a general explanation of why the OMP plan, why it's being implemented? I assume it's for efficiency and volume and everything else.
So thank you. You read my mind. Thank you very much. Runway 1533 is this runway right now. If you recall a while back, there used to be a second runway in the same orientation. At that time, there were 1432s. For safety's sake, we named it 1533 when the other 14 closed. Part of the approved O'Hare modernization plan decommissions both of those runways, and it's on track and it will be decommissioned. I mean, the only way to answer that is it's going away. It's going away either in March or May of 2018. And construction on runway 9 Center, 27 Center is well underway and on track to be commissioned in the fall of 2020. Many different reasons for the O'Hare modernization. If you go back, look at Midway. When was Midway designed? 1940, something like that? Airplanes operate a whole lot differently, and aircraft are getting larger and heavier and need longer pavements. Airplanes did not used to be able to fly with as much crosswind as they can now. So at one point in time, airports needed to be designed with runways in a whole lot of different directions in order to accept traffic under a lot of different wind and weather conditions. Aircraft performance has improved tremendously since the 40s and 50s, when a lot of these airfields with multiple intersecting runways have been, were designed and built. And the volume of traffic steadily increased over many, many years. So if you have a parallel runway configuration, you can do a higher volume of arrival and departure, or a higher rate, rather, of arrival and departure. You have a much safer operation with many fewer runway intersections. We're very concerned with runway safety on the ground. If you have intersecting pavement on the ground, I'm sure you have some challenging intersections in your community as well. Multiply that, amplify that by something to the 100th or 1000th power, and that's the safety concern you have when you have intersecting pavement on an airfield. So for a multitude of reasons, much safer airfield, much better capacity, much more efficient, and it is still something that can be used in all weather conditions. So it was really the city's proposal to make the airport more efficient and more effective and provide that economic engine, if you will. Probably tired of hearing that phrase, but aviation is very much an economic backbone of the economy.
Okay, this one I'm gonna ask you to maybe channel the CDA a little bit, but right now, are there 3 towers at O'Hare?
There are many.
Okay,
There's the old FAA tower, if you remember, from the 70s. That's still there. We sold it or leased it to the city of Chicago. The city uses that to control their ground traffic. So in the winter, when they have 2 or 3 dozen snowplows out there clearing the runways, they manage that operation from our old tower right by the Hilton. Okay. Yes, today the FAA operates 3 air traffic control towers at O'Hare, the main one in the terminal core, one to the north that opened in 2008 with the runway on the far north. We've got the kind of cantilevered tower is up here, and then the other tower is down here. It opened in 2015 with this runway down here.
So the question is, when, as the build-out continues to happen, you keep adding these runways, I assume that do you approve, or is that part of the plan which towers they use? So the question is, right now they don't use the north and south towers at night.
Overnight, that's correct.
Is there a reason why? Is that their choice? Is that something that when you build these, so for example, 9
left, 27
9 left,
right?
27 right at the top, when that gets built in, right?
Yeah, this was commissioned in 2008, and the tower here was commissioned in 2008.
Is that something that could be used in a rotation? Is that something that?
Both the north and south tower, I don't know how much in the weeds you want to get on this. The north and south tower are open all day, dawn to 5 or 6 a.m. till 10 p.m. or so, so that depending on what runways are being used, we have air traffic there. This tower is there so that it can control the traffic on this runway. This tower is here to control the traffic on this runway, as well as some of the taxi routes to and from the runway. So it's only for that runway. It's not, we close the towers down at night. We don't have the staffing to keep 3 control towers staffed and open 24/7.
So
that's a starting point, and then there are a lot of other factors.
Okay, but that does answer my question. So then it's difficult to include some of those outer runways in a overnight runway rotation,
right, if
the towers aren't open.
Right.
And that's a money issue, a manning issue.
Staffing.
Is that something that ONCC does FAA man the towers?
All air traffic control is FAA at
Okay,
O'Hare, yes.
so if ONCC or CDA came to you with a plan that included...
We've talked about it. It's been brought up before, and it would be very costly to do that.
So I know that you said previously that you don't dictate their plan, but is that something where you might tell them the resources aren't there, that has to come out of your plan?
We've had that conversation.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
What else we got, Bob? Well, 2 more questions. Can you I know I'm keeping you 1 minute over now. I want to make sure. And we're gonna aggregate all of these questions, and the same thing we did last time. We're gonna clean them up a little bit and send them to the FAA. And they did just like they did last time. They'll answer every question. So if your question wasn't answered tonight, but it's written down in some way, shape, or form, it's going to get pulled together by the city, and we're going to send it to the FAA. Oh, no, but there was a question that I didn't ask before. How does this soundproofing work if, at some point, if a rotation is deemed, if there's a measurement that because of a certain rotation, a certain community is impacted, can you give us some of the details about maybe additional soundproofing that might be warranted?
So part of that environmental evaluation is a very thorough noise analysis. So as I mentioned, air traffic gets modeled. We look at the fleet mix, how loud those particular kind of aircraft are. Are they operating during the day? Are they operating during night? And we have, again, a mathematical model that plots the 65 day-night noise equivalent contour. And if you fall in that footprint, your home is eligible for federally funded sound insulation. So if CDA and ONCC come to us with a permanent plan for fly quiet, not an interim plan, we don't mandate mitigation for interim conditions. You can talk to your colleague from Norridge and Harwood Heights. They've been living with an interim condition for something like 7 or 8 years, and they did not receive sound insulation for that. So we do not require mitigation for interim conditions. So let's forget about this interim fly quiet. If you want to talk about after 2020, what does fly quiet look like? If there's a rotation, an important part of that environmental analysis will be the modeling, looking at the noise impacts. Overnight noise gets a penalty, a 10 times penalty to daytime noise compared to daytime noise. So that affects the contour, the noise contour, which we talked about last time. I hate to start a large complex topic at the end of the evening, but I didn't bring any slides with the contours. But Bob, you got a contour map from CDA last week, didn't you? Yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm running out of steam here. Yes, the noise will be analyzed, new contours will be drawn, and depending where that contour falls, homes within the 65 DNL contour do become eligible for federal funding for sound insulation.
Okay.
Bob's got a map.
Okay. I think that's it. We kept you a little bit over. I want to thank you very much for your time, very much for your input. I think one of the big benefits we got last time we did this was the questions that the FAA takes after this meeting and submits back to us. Takes them a little time because I think we had 37 questions last time or something like that number. But they did answer every single question. So how about a round of applause for... Thank you for your time. I want to thank the residents for coming out. We got to continue the pressure. We have to be realistic in our expectations. I will say one thing. When I met with Congressman Quigley, and I mentioned this at the meeting, he said this is a collaborative effort. He said, if you want to come to me and say, I don't want any airplanes to fly over O'Hare, in a very nice way, he said, you can go sit on the island over here, but you're going to lose that argument. If you want to be that person that says no airplanes, that's not going to happen. He says there's going to be a rotation, probably. There's going to be some sharing, but the best thing we can do is to keep it up and keep our voices heard. So thank you all for coming. Thanks, staff, too. And Alderman Dunn.
And thank you very much for inviting us. It's always good to have an opportunity to talk about this and help people understand it's a complex operation, lots of moving parts. So thank you for your time coming out on a weeknight evening.
Just keep these here.